On this vote, the yeas are 367, the nays are 0, two-thirds being in the affirmative. The rules are suspended, the resolution is agreed to, and without objection, the motion to reconsider is laid on the table. The gentleman.
For what purpose is the gentlelady from California rise?
For a unanimous consent request.
The gentlewoman is recognized.
I ask unanimous consent that I may hereafter be considered to be the first sponsor of H.R. 1508, a bill originally introduced by Representative Edward Markey of Massachusetts for the purposes of adding co-sponsors and requesting reprintings pursuant to Clause 7 of Rule 12.
Without objection, so ordered. The chair will now entertain requests for one-minute speeches. For what purpose does the gentleman from Texas seek recognition?
I ask unanimous consent to address the House for 1 minute. Rise and extend my remarks.
Without objection, the gentleman is recognized for 1 minute.
Mr. Speaker, the United Nations Arms Trade Treaty signed by this administration today is an attempt by third world countries to control guns worldwide, including personal firearms in the United States. Under the section of scope, the treaty indicates that covered weapons include small arms and light weapons. The language is so broad that nations are expected to track all weapon movements from the time they are manufactured till the time they are destroyed. The language is vague so that the treaty could be interpreted to restrict the ability of the United States to help its allies, like Israel. The UN treaty allows government regulations to be imposed to collect data on gun owners. The treaty presents a clear and present danger to the Second Amendment of the United States Constitution. This is another attempt by this administration to control firearms of individual Americans. The constitutional professor is letting the UN override the Second Amendment and destroy individual liberty. The President took an oath to the United States Constitution, not the UN Charter. And that's just the way it is. I yield back.
For what purpose does the gentlelady from Tennessee seek? Gentleman from Tennessee seek recognition.
Thank you, sir. To address the House for 1 minute, unanimous consent.
Without objection, the gentleman recognized for 1 minute.
Figured as much. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm pleased today that the House just passed H.R. 1961. It gives the Delta Queen another opportunity to go up and down the Mississippi River. The Delta Queen is a national treasure that for 80 years took passengers up and down the river and, of course, stopped in my hometown of Memphis. On its last trip about 3 or 4 years ago, I was there to witness the Queen's last trip, and it was an emotional time for a lot of Memphians who really revere the river and the traffic thereon. There were issues about safety, but those issues, I think, are satisfied the concerns of people. There were ocean standards put to a riverboat which were improper. The unions that opposed this in the past came to be for it. The bill passed, and it's important that it did. The Delta Queen is a safe vessel that will provide a wonderful experience for people traveling up and down the Mississippi River, America's greatest river. It's a treasure, a piece of history. It's also economic development for the region. So I thank my colleagues for supporting both the Delta Queen and the communities along the river, and I look forward to a nice trip on the Delta Queen one time and a julep to boot. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield back the balance of my time.
For what purpose does the gentlelady from Tennessee seek recognition?
The House for 1 minute, revise and extend.
Without objection, the gentlelady is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. You know, there's been a lot of talk, delay, defund, repeal, replace. That's what we're doing when it comes to Obamacare, and indeed that's what the American people want. They continue to tell us that they want protections from the harmful impact of Obamacare, and they want to make certain that we keep the federal government open. The House has passed legislation that does control spending, it defunds Obamacare, and it prevents a government shutdown. House Republicans are leading the fight to control spending, to stop Obamacare, and to protect hard-working Americans, and it is time for the Senate to join us. Here's a great example of the harmful effects of Obamacare. In Nashville, Tennessee, a 27-year-old young man, non-smoker, currently pays $41 a month. Pays $41 a month for health insurance. Under Obamacare, guess what? That premium goes to $114 per month. $41, $114 per month. That is the impact and the effect of Obamacare. Yield back.
The gentlelady's time has expired. For what purpose does the gentleman from California seek recognition?
I seek unanimous consent to address the House for 1 minute and to revise and extend my remarks.
Without objection, the gentleman is recognized for 1 minute.
Mr. Speaker, I rise to recognize Jensen Ranch Elementary School from Castro Valley, California, in my congressional district, which was recently named as a 2013 National Blue Ribbon School by the Department of Education. The National Blue Ribbon School program recognizes public and private elementary, middle, and high schools for overall academic or improved performance. 2 representatives from Jensen Ranch have been invited to Washington, D.C. in November for the recognition ceremony, where they will receive the National Blue Ribbon School plaque and flag to proudly display at their school. Jensen Ranch is just one of 15 California schools recognized with this prestigious award. Led by Principal Melanie Stibick, Jensen Ranch has been actively working to integrate new technology into the classroom and has implemented early intervention programs for students who are struggling to read and write. Jensen Ranch's commitment to providing a top-notch education program will help its students learn, grow, and thrive in our communities. Congratulations again to the teachers, administrators, parents, and students that helped Jensen Ranch achieve this well-deserved award. And I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back. For what purpose does the gentleman from Wisconsin seek recognition?
I ask unanimous consent to address the House for 1 minute and revise and extend my remarks.
The gentleman is recognized for 1 minute. Without objection.
Mr. Speaker, I rise today to honor the valiant service of one of Wisconsin's war heroes, Einar Engman. He's from Tomahawk, Wisconsin. Sergeant Engman was awarded the Medal of Honor for his outstanding bravery and courage and going above and beyond the call of duty. While serving in the Korean War, members of then Corporal Engman's company were pinned down by enemy fire. Corporal Engman proceeded to charge the enemy's machine gun position by himself. After single-handedly disabling the enemy's first position with only a grenade and rifle fire, Corporal Engman charged their second position and was seriously injured. Nevertheless, with incredible courage and stamina, Corporal Engman rose and took out the enemy's entire gun squad using only his rifle before he fell unconscious because of his wounds. As a result of his actions, the defense of the enemy was broken, and more than 100 hostile troops abandoned their positions and fled in disorganized retreat. It's for his courage and unwavering devotion and duty to country that I stand here today to honor the service of Sergeant Einar Engman. I say, sir, your country is proud and grateful. Thank you. I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. For what purpose does the gentleman from New Jersey seek recognition?
I ask unanimous consent to address the House for 1 minute and to revise and extend my remarks.
Without objection, the gentleman is recognized for 1 minute.
Mr. Speaker, I rise today as a member of the Safe Climate Caucus to say the evidence is clear. The Earth's climate is changing, and human actions are the primary cause. Climate change is not something that can be addressed at the last minute. The continuing resolution, the debt ceiling, the Farm Bill, we're governing by crisis now. This Congress has failed to act or even consider legislation related to climate change because this Congress is stuck in a last-minute way of thinking. Governing by crisis makes it nearly impossible to undertake those actions that require a long-term perspective, those things that are important but not recognized as an immediate crisis. But climate change is immediate, and it is a crisis. Just ask the victims of the droughts, the floods, the wildfires, the superstorms that are costing American lives and dollars. Ask the victims if this is a crisis. To start dealing with this crisis, we should stop emitting greenhouse gases and wean ourselves from fossil fuels.
The gentleman yields back. For what purpose does the gentleman from Louisiana seek recognition?
I ask unanimous consent to speak to the House for 1 minute.
Without objection, the gentleman recognized for 1 minute.
Mr. Speaker, hate is a strong word that's usually meant to provoke a negative response, which is why it's so troubling when a decades-old, multi-million-dollar activist organization uses its power to smear other organizations with the label hate group. But that's exactly what the Southern Poverty Law Center does. On its website, you'll find a hate map pinpointing groups like the American Family Association and the Family Research Council. Southern Poverty Law Center doesn't agree with AFA or FRC on traditional marriage, and that's appropriate. That's their choice. That's their right. But rather than supporting the First Amendment rights of those groups to express their deeply held moral beliefs, SPLC brands them right alongside organizations that promote race-based violence. Last week, a man was sentenced to 25 years in jail after he found the Family Research Council headquarters on SPLC's hate map and went there with a gun hoping to kill as many FRC employees as possible. Words do have consequences, and it's time that the Southern Poverty Law Center stops using whatever influence it has left to incite hatred towards people of faith. And I yield back.
The gentleman's time has expired. For what purpose does the gentleman from Oregon seek recognition?
Commissioner, address the House for 1 minute.
Without objection, the gentleman from Oregon is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. For the last 5 years, I've been working to try and help make the promise that we made to Iraqis and Afghans who helped our soldiers in those battles, that we keep our promise to them to protect them as we leave. Now, because they helped America, their lives are in great peril to people who have long memories and hate America. The special immigrant visa program that would allow them to come to the United States is a mess. It doesn't work very well, it's slow and convoluted, but now it's going to expire in 5 days. We have a no-cost solution to at least allow it to continue to limp along. But the House Judiciary Committee, despite broad bipartisan support for this no-cost, simple solution, has refused so far to be able to move it forward. Every member of the House should insist that we keep our obligation to these people who helped our soldiers to be able to protect them and their families. It's our moral obligation, and I strongly urge each member to make their views known.
The gentleman's time has expired. For what purpose does the gentleman from Pennsylvania seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, request unanimous consent to address the House for 1 minute and revise and extend.
Without objection, the gentleman from Pennsylvania is recognized for 1 minute.
Mr. Speaker, in July of 2012, the National Collegiate Athletic Association bypassed its own enforcement rules and procedures and rescinded 40 academic scholarships from the Pennsylvania State University. The decision disqualified student-athletes, academic achievers, who had nothing to do with the tragic events that had transpired at the university. The NCAA's decision was misdirected and a complete contradiction of the association's goal, which is to promote access to higher education among student-athletes. This Monday, the NCAA announced it would gradually restore the scholarships that were wrongfully revoked last year. Despite this welcome news, I stand by my initial correspondence with the NCAA, suggesting the decision to take punitive action against past, present, and future students for an institutional failure and actions out of their hands was completely unjustified. Mr. Speaker, the resilience of the Penn State students, alumni, the broader community, and especially the victims during this very challenging time has been nothing short of inspirational. I give my commitment to them to continue to push back against the arbitrary actions of the NCAA and will not back down until they correct their actions. Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I yield back to balance my time.
The gentleman yields back. For what purpose does the gentlelady from Texas seek recognition?
And to address the House and revise and extend my remarks.
Without objection, the gentlelady is recognized for 1 minute.
In the last 21 hours, we have heard a discourse on green eggs and ham and a multitude of other commentary that spoke to the will of one person. But I believe America wants this body and the other body to stand on behalf of those who cannot speak for themselves. I rise to call upon this body to vote and cast a vote for America. The soldiers that have left our soil and those who are still here, whose families need compensation and need to survive. The Medicare recipients who need to have their benefits processed, Medicaid recipients, those who need clean air and clean water. The government of the United States is not frivolous or wasteful. The government is a rainy day umbrella for those who suffer from all manner of devastation and disaster. I don't know about the thoughts of 21 hours, but I do know that I'm going to stand against a clouded and crowded continuing resolution. Vote to keep the government open and start using Obamacare on October 1st. That's the American way. That's the vote for all of America. And that's the vote for the vulnerable who cannot speak for themselves. Mr. Speaker, I yield back my time.
The gentlelady's time has expired. For what purpose does the gentleman from New Mexico seek recognition?
Request unanimous consent to address the House for 1 minute and revise.
Without objection, the gentleman is recognized for 1 minute.
Mr. Speaker, for the last few days I've been in the Southern District of New Mexico. We've had the opportunity to visit the devastation caused by the flooding in that area. We've seen houses that have been completely destroyed, Traeger houses washed off their foundations. We've had loss of life. We've had loss of livestock. Even the ground in certain farms washed away, and the underlying road beds washed away 8 and 10 foot deep in some areas. But in all of that, we see the inspirational actions of our first responders, of volunteers, people who came out and worked around the clock to provide help for their neighbors. In one instance, neighbors knew that a young couple was away from home, took pickup trucks and unloaded their house, moved it to safety before it washed off its foundation. These are the things that make America great. These are the things that make New Mexico great. Anytime we see calamity, we have the opportunity to see the other side of America, and it shines brightly. I yield back, Mr. Speaker.
The gentleman yields back. For what purpose does the gentleman from Texas seek recognition? Okay. Without objection, the gentleman is recognized for 1 minute.
Today, Mr. Speaker, a young man was sentenced because he listened to the propaganda of an organization that I consider a hate group. This group says that if you don't agree with him, if you don't fall in the line, then you deserve to be on our list. They list the Family Research Council, godly people that their sole purpose is to reach out to families. Yet this young man, reading literature from the Southern Poverty Law Center, took it upon himself to feel that the Family Research Council needed to be punished. This young man picked up a gun and went over there to murder people whose greatest desire was to promote family values. As he unloaded his gun, someone stopped him. And today he was sentenced. But to this day, we have not heard an apology from the Southern Poverty Law Center. We have not heard any words from them criticizing those actions. And to this day, we don't hear any apologies or we don't hear any cries for what that young man did. But the Southern Poverty Law Center continues to list an enemies list of anybody that disagrees with them politically. Mr. Speaker, I yield back the time, but I'm waiting for their apology. Thank you.
The gentleman yields back. For what purpose does the gentleman from Pennsylvania seek recognition? Without objection, the gentleman is recognized for 1 minute.
Mr. Speaker, in the United States, a child is diagnosed with cancer every 36 minutes. Cancer remains the leading cause of death by disease for children under 15. Now, each September is Pediatric Cancer Month and an awareness month. I'd just like to point out there is a program by Hyundai Motor America and Hyundai dealers. We have raised over $72 million in the fight against pediatric cancer. We are able to turn back the clock, and at this time, we can say that almost 85% of children who come up with this dreaded disease survive. So it is with great pride that I'm here this evening. I'd also like to point out, in this past July, Hyundai Hope of Wheels awarded a $75,000 grant to Children's Hospital of Pittsburgh at the University of Pittsburgh, which will help Dr. J. Anthony Graves continue his cancer therapies to treat children from the 3rd District of Pennsylvania and beyond. I thank you, and I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. For what purpose does the gentleman from Texas seek recognition?
Ask to address the House for 1 minute.
Without objection, the gentleman from Texas is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We've had August to hear from our constituents, and most of us have. And what we've been hearing is tragic. For every several hundred people that give us a story of how dramatically and badly their lives have been affected by Obamacare, there's one or two that says, hey, my 26-year-old got to be on our family insurance, not realizing Republicans had agreed to do that, would have done that, along with some pre-existing condition fixes. But Obamacare is devastating families and individuals across America. It's bad for America. It's bad for people's health. It's going to prevent seniors from getting the help they need. It's time, when you know these things, to stand up and stand for the health and well-being of people and this economy. Let's defund Obamacare. I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. The Chair lays before the House the following personal requests. The clerk will read.
Leave of absence requested for Mr. Rush of Illinois for today, September 25th through September 29th.
Without objection, the request is granted. Under the Speaker's announced policy of January 3, 2013, the gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Kelly, is recognized for 60 minutes as the designee of the Majority Leader.
Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent that all members may have 5 legislative days in which to revise and extend their remarks and include extraneous material on the subject of my special order.
Without objection, so ordered.
Mr. Speaker, I rise today in opposition to the United Nations Arms Trade Treaty, which Secretary Kerry signed today at a UN ceremony on behalf of the United States. My opposition and my colleagues' opposition is not a Republican agenda. It is the defense of all Americans' right as enshrined in our Constitution and in our Bill of Rights. The Obama administration's participation in the Arms Trade Treaty has left a trail of broken promises, and all in the forms of red lines. This administration has laid out and later abandoned, and I'd like to talk about a few of them right now. Mr. Speaker, I would like to submit into the record the State Department's webpage listing key U.S. red lines for the ATT. Now, one of these red lines says the Second Amendment to the Constitution must be upheld. But the treaty contains only weak, non-binding reference to civilian ownership and fails to uphold the fundamental individual right to keep and to bear arms that is enshrined in our Second Amendment. Now, furthermore, the treaty encourages nations to collect the identities of owners of imported firearms. It creates the core of a national gun registry that violates existing U.S. law. But it doesn't stop there. The Arms Trade Treaty requires nations to report the data they collect to the United Nations. If this data contains information on individual owners, it would constitute a serious, dangerous privacy violation. Now, it sounds like this administration doesn't take this Second Amendment red line very seriously. Another red line says the ATT negotiations must have consensus decision-making to allow us to protect U.S. equities. Now, in the UN, consensus means unanimity, all members on board in totality. But when that failed, the Obama administration supported the ATT's adoption of a simple majority rule vote in the United Nations General Assembly. The administration broke its own most important red line. Now, the U.S. regularly demands that negotiations are conducted by consensus to protect our interests and our sovereignty, which is critical when the U.S. is in the minority or when we are standing alone in the UN. Now, by breaking their own red line, this administration has seriously reduced U.S. credibility, because other countries now know that if they push hard enough, America will accept a majority rule vote. In February 2010, Undersecretary of State Ellen Tascher stated, if the whole world does not sign on, then the ATT is less than useless. A number of key nation states, including such stalwarts of freedom and liberty, Russia, China, and others like India, Indonesia, Iran, and North Korea, among many others, do not support the Arms Trade Treaty. Therefore, the United Nations Arms Trade Treaty is less than useless. Is the ATT less than useless, or is consensus just another red line that the Obama administration doesn't take very seriously? Today, Secretary Kerry said this treaty will not diminish anyone's freedom. Here is yet but another promise. Do we really think it's credible? Last month, the Obama administration took executive action to ban the import of Korean War-era vintage collectible M1s Garand rifles on spurious public safety grounds. These are collector's items. This shows how this administration action can be used to choke off firearms imports. The United Nations Arms Trade Treaty will only encourage more mischief. It only holds the good accountable and lets the bad do what they want. In the real world, promises do matter. We have made strategic, moral, and legal commitments to provide arms to key allies, such as the Republic of China, Taiwan, and the State of Israel. What do these promises really mean to President Obama? And what message does the ATT send to our allies? And they wonder, is America really there for us when we need them? Or is this just more talk, more empty words? The American people have had enough of the Obama administration's broken promises and phony, non-existent red lines on the ATT. I urge my colleagues to join together to oppose the ATT. Now, at this time, Mr. Speaker, I would like to yield some time to my friend from Oregon, Mr. Greg Walden.
I thank the gentleman, my friend and great defender of the United States Constitution, Mr. Kelly of Pennsylvania. This is a very troubling day for those of us who believe in our freedom in America and our rights under the Constitution, and every day defend America's sovereignty. You know, Oregon's 2nd Congressional District is nearly 70,000 square miles. That's a lot of ground. It's home to some of the best hunting in the West, including mule deer and elk and cougar, bighorn sheep and antelope, in addition to various waterfowl and upland birds. Oregonians' proud heritage of hunting and owning firearms for sport and protection and their livelihood dates back to the days of the Oregon Trail, a trail my ancestors crossed in 1845 when they helped settle the West. It was one hunter in Baker City, Oregon, told me earlier this year, he said, Congressman, you know why they call this the 2nd District. It's because we believe in our Second Amendment rights. And he's right. Yet today, about 10 hours ago, Secretary of State John Kerry signed a very vague UN treaty that leaves open the door to international influences trampling on our Second Amendment rights to keep and bear arms, and it encourages signatory nations to collect identities of owners of imported firearms, setting the stage for a potential national gun registry, and that is wrong. The United States is a sovereign nation. I strongly believe that our Constitution, including our Second Amendment rights, must never be subrogated by a treaty. Now, what's worse, we understand the administration that signed this treaty may now never send it to the Senate for consideration. I view that as another blatant attempt by the Obama administration to act unilaterally. They seem to do a lot of that these days without the consent or the approval of Congress. So I will strongly oppose not only this treaty, but also any funding to implement any policy related to this treaty, and I will continue to uphold the oath of office that each one of us in this chamber took to defend our rights and freedoms as enshrined in that great document, the Constitution, and to make sure that our Constitution and our sovereign rights are always above any foreign treaty, including one that never even gets sent to the Senate.
I yield back to my colleague from Pennsylvania.
I thank the gentleman, and I now recognize Mr. Lamborn from Colorado.
Thank you, Congressman Kelly, for hosting this important hour to share with the American people the serious problems with the UN Arms Trade Treaty. Mr. Speaker, as co-chairman of the House Sovereignty Caucus, I assure you this ambiguous treaty poses serious threats to American national security, foreign policy, and economic interest, as well as our constitutional rights. U.S. arms exports are among the safest in the world. The United States should reject the UN's attempt to force us into a system that could jeopardize the safety of our citizens or those of our allies. This treaty includes small arms and light weapons within its scope, which covers firearms owned by law-abiding Americans. It sets up a broad registration scheme that threatens the individual's firearms rights. The Arms Trade Treaty also threatens the ability of the U.S. to protect our allies around the world, since it contains questionable language that could be misused to prevent America from arming allies such as Israel or Taiwan. President Obama knows that even members of his own party won't support this treaty in many cases. He must think that gun control must be pursued no matter what. In my own state of Colorado, voters just recalled 2 state senators who pushed gun control against the wishes of their voters. These were historic elections because no Colorado legislator had ever been recalled in the history of the state. I urge the members of the Senate to reject this treaty and protect our Second Amendment rights and our national sovereignty. Thank you, and I yield back to the gentleman from Pennsylvania.
I thank my friend, and I now recognize Mr. Collins from Georgia.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and also thank you, my colleague from Pennsylvania. Mr. Speaker, I rise today to speak out against the dangerous UN Arms Trade Treaty, which was signed this morning by Secretary Kerry. This treaty will impact the United States sovereignty, encroach upon the Second Amendment rights, and drastically affect U.S. foreign and export policies. It is common for a treaty of this kind to give definitions directly so member states can understand the treaty's meanings and implications. Instead, this agreement uses vague terms that are open for reinterpretation later. It leaves open the opportunity for current restrictions to be tightened at a later time. This has the potential of heavily influencing our nation's future policies without congressional consideration or approval. Our Second Amendment liberties articulated in the Bill of Rights are put at a significant inherent risk by this treaty. Approximately 1/3 of domestic gun market is composed of imported firearms. The Arms Trade Treaty encourages nations to collect the identities of the owners of imported firearms. This could be the beginning of a national gun registry, which would violate current U.S. law. The treaty would also impose administrative burdens on the import and exports of small arms. This treaty would directly affect how U.S. handles foreign policy, and the United States should be able to look into potential arms sales by weighing the risk, potential outcomes, and goals of each trade. Under the UN Arms Trade Treaty, the U.S. would have to complete a checklist of items before exporting arms, regardless of their destination, even if the destination is Israel or Taiwan. It will come as no surprise that the Arms Trade Treaty is not being backed by Russia, China, India, Iran, North Korea, and numerous other nations, many of whom do not have our best interest in mind. In February 2010, this was called less than useless if not supported by all nations. Why is this administration now locking the United States into a treaty that other world powers have rejected? Their unilateral decision to sign the treaty allows other nations to trade arms knowing that the U.S. will be bound by a specific set of rules. Like the majority of the folks in Georgia's 9th District, I cannot understand why this administration would sign a treaty with such drastic implications for our nation's sovereignty and the right to bear arms at home. The United States should not join treaties outside the constitutionally prescribed process, which involves ratification by the Senate. This is a concept this administration just amazingly seems to not understand, especially from a constitutional law professor. There's a reason the Constitution dictates the method and manner by which the United States may enter into treaties. It is to ensure that the treaty so harmful to our freedoms, such as this Arms Trade Treaty, is never signed or ratified. I strongly oppose this administration's endorsement of the UN Arms Trade Treaty and will work with my colleagues to prevent this agreement from affecting the rights of our citizens. The executive branch does not and should not possess a blank check to legislate domestically via international treaties. There is no treaty so important that it should not be allowed to restrict the rights of Americans to exercise those freedoms enshrined in the Constitution. The right to keep and bear arms is not dependent on a global agreement. We don't need Russia and China giving their stamp of approval in order to speak freely in our homes and in our churches, and we certainly don't need Iran and North Korea dictating our due process rights. I strongly oppose the UN Arms Trade Treaty and everything it stands for, and I do not and will not support the decision made by Secretary Kerry to sign this treaty. I thank the gentleman from Pennsylvania for his tireless leadership on this issue and hosting this special order tonight, and with that, I yield back.
I thank the gentleman from Georgia. I'd now like to recognize my friend from North Carolina, Mr. Richard Hudson.
Thank you. Mr. Speaker, I rise this evening to join my colleagues to voice my strongest opposition to the United Nations Arms Trade Treaty currently before the United Nations. First and foremost, by signing this overreaching treaty, the administration is crippling one of our most fundamental rights, the Second Amendment, the right to keep and bear arms. The Second Amendment is our most fundamental right because it ensures that we can maintain our other rights. Second, by their own admission, the President and his administration have said this vague treaty is difficult to interpret. Why would we engage in an ambiguous and harmful agreement like this? Finally, the President's own State Department said this treaty will have international implications for U.S. arms sales to Israel and Taiwan. Why would we engage in an agreement that would damage our relationships with two of our strongest allies and give veto power over decisions to sell arms to our allies to other nations around the world? Mr. Speaker, I spent the past weekend in a deer stand and cannot imagine allowing the laws of other countries to stop my ability and the ability of other Americans from enjoying this tradition that I've enjoyed my entire life. The people I represent in North Carolina can't understand why this administration is seeking to damage our personal liberty and the sovereignty of our great nation. We must oppose this treaty, and I encourage our colleagues in the Senate to do the same. Mr. Speaker, I yield back to the gentleman from Pennsylvania and thank him for his leadership on this issue.
I thank the gentleman from North Carolina. The comments are very timely and very needed. At this time, I'd like to have Mr. Steve Stockman from Texas 36 address the situation.
Mike, I wouldn't mind you representing me. Mr. Speaker, I'm appalled. Our friend said, you know, Republicans are in the bedroom. But we have a president who's collecting our phone records, collecting our medical records, and now wants to collect our gun records. Where in the world and when do we say stop? I mean, even our friends in the media, he collected their records. And now we have a treaty, so-called treaty, with stamps on our individual rights, undermines our Constitution, and strips us of any kind of protection. They said, don't worry about it. The Senate will never ratify it. But in a tradition of treaties, once a treaty is signed, our nation typically follows that treaty. Yet we're seeing before us a president who's not listening to the people. Time and time again, these actions are taken when there's, like a magician, he's over here focusing over here, and he did this a day in which a Texas senator was speaking. This is all designed for us to be asleep while our rights are being stripped. When is the American people going to wake up and realize that the book 1984 has come about? Your rights are being stripped, and I hear nothing. My friend Bill Murray, who is an unwilling participant in a lawsuit to take prayer out of schools, said it best. His mother was an atheist who sued. And he said the greatest fear that she had was that the American people would rise up. But what happened was nothing. Not a word was said. And today, your rights were stripped. And we hear silence. It reminds me when Jesus was praying and he turned to his disciples and they fell asleep, there was silence. Go on, sleep. America, go on, sleep. Your rights are being stripped and you say nothing. I yield back.
I thank the gentleman from Texas. At this time, I'd like to recognize Jim Bridenstine who represents Oklahoma 51.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd also like to thank my colleague, Congressman Kelly from Pennsylvania, for yielding me the time. I'd also like to thank my good friend, the senior senator from Oklahoma, Jim Inhofe, who has been the upper chamber's fiercest opponent of the United Nations Arms Trade Treaty. I'm proud that Senator Inhofe also stands firmly with Senator Cruz in his fight to defund Obamacare. There seems to be some confusion about that back in Oklahoma, but he has been standing with Senator Cruz from the beginning. Mr. Speaker, already this year the President tried to ban guns he thinks look scary. They don't operate any differently. They just look scary, so he tried to ban them. Rejected by Congress, the President tried to create what is effectively a national gun registry. The American people and their representatives rejected that plan as well. In response, President Obama today had his Secretary of State sign what is effectively an international gun control treaty that will ultimately force all of us to register our guns and our names and our information into an international database. President Obama once again demonstrated his hostility to the Constitution, to the Second Amendment, and to the U.S. sovereignty by signing the UN Arms Trade Treaty. This President is fundamentally antagonistic toward both our constitutional right to keep and bear arms and American independence from international bodies. Why is the UN Arms Trade Treaty so dangerous? First, the treaty is ambiguously worded. Its basic terms are not even defined, which permits gun-grabbing UN bureaucrats the widest possible interpretive scope. We all know that the UN gun grabbers will interpret this treaty just as loosely as the President interprets the Constitution of the United States. Second, the Arms Trade Treaty is a direct shot at the Second Amendment of the Constitution. Lawful ownership and use of firearms, including for self-defense, are basic constitutional rights. The treaty does not recognize this. In fact, the Arms Trade Treaty, quote, encourages governments to collect the identities of individual end users of imported firearms at the national level, unquote. This is the core of a national gun registry. The treaty also creates a national, quote, responsibility to prevent the, quote, diversion of firearms for illegal trade. Since illicit trade is not defined, does this mean one American selling a gun to another American counts as illegal? Who's to say? Groups like Amnesty International have already stated that the Arms Trade Treaty is a start down the path of control for domestic internal gun sales. This is international gun control, plain and simple. Mr. Speaker, the Arms Trade Treaty is fully consistent with the President's policy of ceding more U.S. sovereignty to international bodies. He's pushed the Senate to ratify treaties that do nothing except diminish U.S. sovereignty. These treaties include the UN Conventions on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, the rights of children, and the elimination of discrimination against women. Does this mean that the United States finds no morally compelling interest in protecting disabled persons, children, or women? Of course not. In each of these cases, U.S. domestic law imposes far higher standards of protection than many of the countries that have ratified all three of these treaties. For example, such beacons of human freedom as Cuba and China, Nigeria, Russia, and Syria have ratified all three of these treaties. North Korea and Iran have ratified 2 of the 3. Unlike these countries, though, the United States actually upholds its treaty obligations. Mr. Speaker, the Arms Trade Treaty is a perfect example of a dangerous trend in international legal thinking called transnationalism. The goal of transnationalists is to, quote, circumvent resistant legislatures and, quote, download so-called global norms. We've heard the President talk about global norms ad nauseum. But the idea is to circumvent resistant legislatures and download global norms into U.S. and other domestic law. Let me say that again. The transnationalists pushing the Arms Trade Treaty, like Amnesty International, want to avoid Congress. They want to avoid us, the people's representatives, and impose international law from foreign bodies. Mr. Speaker, perhaps the pro-Arms Trade Treaty supporters need a lesson in the U.S. Constitution. The Constitution is the supreme law of the land. We choose those that govern us and under which laws we live. We should not give up our God-given rights and liberties to foreign bodies such as the United Nations. The Second Amendment is not up for debate. And the individual right of Americans to keep and bear arms is not a matter of discussion for foreigners. The President will treat the Arms Trade Treaty as binding on America, no matter what the Senate does. He can't impose gun control in Congress, so he's going to use an international treaty instead. I pray that the Senate rips this treaty to pieces and that our next President removes America's signature and, with it, this hideous assault on our Constitution. Thank you so much, and I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Breinstein. At this time, I'd like to recognize the member from Mississippi 1, Mr. Alan Nunley.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I want to thank my friend from Pennsylvania for yielding, but also for his leadership on this important issue. I rise in strong opposition to the United Nations Arms Trade Treaty. The Obama administration has a disturbing tendency to favor international regulation over American sovereignty. And this Arms Trade Treaty is just the latest example. The government of the United States was created by we the people. And we the people established the Constitution in order to limit that government. But as a condition of establishing that Constitution, we the people insisted that a Bill of Rights be adopted, a Bill of Rights that would guarantee every citizen of our nation rights. An important plank in that Bill of Rights includes the right to keep and bear arms, and it's guaranteed by our Constitution. Under no circumstances should we ever agree to a treaty that undermines on that right. This arms trade treaty encourages nations to collect the identities of owners of imported firearms, which constitutes the core of a national gun registry. The treaty also requires nations to report the data they collect to the United Nations. If that data contains information on individual gun owners, it would be a serious violation of privacy. The treaty could also restrict the ability of the United States to conduct foreign policy and to sell arms to our allies such as Israel. Now, we've seen in recent months what happens when we rely on the international community to act on America's interest. Russia, China, and the rest of the United Nations should never be given veto authority over American foreign policy, and we should never, ever subject the United States Constitution to the whims of the United Nations. The Second Amendment is sacred. We should always stand up and protect it. And that's why I strongly oppose the United Nations Arms Treaty and urge the United States Senate to reject it forthrightly. I yield back.
I thank the gentleman from Mississippi. You know, Mr. Speaker, we've heard from a number of members tonight, and I think this is a day that we really have to reflect back and look at mixed messages. Back in 2009 at a NATO summit in Strasbourg, France, the President said, "I believe in American exceptionalism, just as I suspect that the Brits believe in British exceptionalism and the Greeks believe in Greek exceptionalism." Yesterday, the President stood in front of the United Nations and said, "Some may disagree, but I believe America is exceptional, in part because we have shown a willingness through the sacrifice of blood and treasure to stand up not only for our own narrow self-interest, but for the interest of all." I would just like to suggest to the President that integrity is defined by saying what you mean and meaning what you say. Taking a moment to express something that may or may not be the true core value of who you are, what you believe, is not acceptable. What makes us truly exceptional as Americans is we are there every day in every way to those who we told we would be. Now, the U.S. has the most sophisticated arms export control system in the world. It has commonly been called the gold standard. And that term, gold standard, was used by then Secretary of State Hillary Clinton. Yet this arms trade treaty does nothing at all to improve our system. We not only have laws on the export of arms, we actually enforce them. People can and regularly do go to jail for breaking those laws. Now, the arms trade treaty will not improve the systems in other countries, which in many cases actually have no system at all. There's a lot more to running an effective arms export control system than simply signing a piece of paper and using your signature to express something that is not truly in your heart. There's so much vagueness with this arms trade treaty. Our regulations describing what we control are the most sophisticated in the world. It is really extremely difficult to evade them with word games. We mean what we say and we say what we mean. It's just integrity. Simple. The arms trade treaty, by contrast, is so vague that it offers many opportunities for nations to claim they are complying with the treaty while really carrying on as normal. This has the effect of legitimizing the action of bad actors. Now, we have a regular system for actually making decisions about what we will export and to whom we will export it. This system takes many things into account, but it is fundamentally based on upholding the United States national interest. It is not controlled by exporters, unlike in Europe where exporter interests actually dominate their policies. This arms trade treaty will do nothing to change that, but it will give exporter-dominated nations a shield to hide behind. Now, every nation-state can control the arms trade if it's truly willing to do so, and the United States is ready to help. But few have meaningful laws about the arms trade, and even fewer make any attempt to enforce them. The United States has two major programs to help the serious countries. The first, the Export Control and Related Border Security Assistance, and it goes by the term EXPAS, is run from the State Department. The second is the Humanitarian Mine Action Program, HMA, which includes stockpile conventional munitions assistance intended to assist in the disposal, demilitarization, security, and management of explosive stockpiles, which is run by the Department of Defense. Now, according to the State Department, the U.S. has contributed over $2 billion to reduce the harmful effects of illicit, indiscriminately used conventional weapons through Conventional Weapons Destruction Program, which includes the HMA. In other words, the United States actually backs its words with money and investment, and we have made that attempt throughout the whole world. Listen, our arms export control system is the gold standard of the world. We're not greedy with our gold. We are willing to share our practical knowledge with nation-states that are serious about arms export controls. Let us not fall for the fool's gold of a treaty that truly overpromises and underdelivers. Now, Mr. Speaker, I would like to express my gratitude to the members of Congress from around the country who joined me tonight in this special order to oppose the United Nations Arms Trade Treaty, and I would ask the citizens of the United States, as Mr. Stockman said, please wake up. We are losing our country day by day in ways that we do not recognize, in ways that we do not know. And truly, the sacrifice that this nation has made over the years, 1.4 million of our men and women in uniform have died to preserve those personal freedoms and liberties. This is not a good day for the United States. This is a day when the United States lowered its expectations and its exceptionalism to something that does not truly protect the United States and has a dire effect on our sovereignty as a nation. I thank you and I yield back.
The gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Kelly, yields back. The chair would entertain a motion to adjourn.
So moved.
The question is on the motion to adjourn. Those in favor say aye. Those opposed, no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The motion is adopted. Accordingly, the House stands adjourned until 10 a.m. tomorrow for morning hour debate.
The House today sent back to the Senate a bill dealing with the federal helium reserve. The measure allows the reserve to continue selling crude helium after the program's debt is repaid. Congressional Quarterly writes that this prevents the closure of the program on October 7th and the possible helium shortage. Funding for federal agencies runs out at the end of the month, and House and Senate leaders continue to negotiate on a short-term bill to keep the government operating. We spoke with a Capitol Hill reporter about that.